Hi, everyone. Welcome. Take your seats, pull up your second or third cup of coffee. My name's John Bracken. I'm with the Digital Public Library of America. Really excited to have you here. My job is to say welcome and talk slowly while you folks are coming in and clicking on into the Zoom room. And I think folks are coming in. So welcome. This is welcome to DPLA if you haven't been here before. One of the adaptations to the pandemic that we started earlier this year was to do book talks. So we're really excited to do this one with Tim. Even more, I mean, maybe not even more excited. We're just as excited to be able to collaborate with our friends at Unfinished in the form of Damon today. I'm not even going to introduce the amazing project that is Unfinished. I just want to say on behalf of DPLA, welcome. I think the conversation and the focus on Tim's book is really timely for us. We've been spending a lot of time, including in an event with Knight Foundation and Surgeon General Murthy last month, thinking about the health of the web, the concerns about the health of the web and how it's impacting larger society. I think one of a lot of us have been thinking a lot personally and professionally about the impact that misinformation and that the sort of the negative impacts of this amazing technology that's bringing us together today has been having on our democracy, on society, on our planet and on our families. And I think some of the cases and arguments that Tim makes provides some of the economic rationale about how we got here. One note about DPLA as an open digital public library, our next event after this, after the holidays, is an open board meeting, open community board meeting that we're doing January 10th, if I'm not mistaken. And my colleague Kat will throw a link into that if you're interested in hearing more about DPLA and our community. And with that, welcome, enjoy your time, sit back and lean in to engage. And Damon, over to you.
All right, thank you so much, John. Yeah, so I just wanted to start and say, thank you again to DPLA for partnering with Unfinished for this event. As many of you in the chat probably know, DPLA is here to empower people to learn, grow, and contribute to a diverse and better functioning society by maximizing access to our shared history, culture, and knowledge, which is a mission that we are deeply aligned with at Unfinished, where we work to strengthen civic life in the digital age. Unfinished, which is, it's a new enterprise, and we work with a network of partners to imagine the future of technology, culture, and our economy to create a thriving multiracial democracy. You can learn more about us and sign up for our newsletter, where we've posted content related to this conversation for the past few weeks at unfinished.com. All of this to say that Tim's book, Subprime Attention Crisis, seen right here, really cool cover, by the way, Tim. Maybe we can talk about that too.
Thank you, yeah.
Hopefully you can pick this up at a local library or a local bookseller. So Tim, your book, Subprime Attention Crisis, it investigates the digital ad economy to tell a story about how big tech financializes our attention and how precarious the state of affairs really is, which is actually a perfect entry point into a conversation about the future of technology, culture, and our economy. In fact, our lives are shaped to a great extent by the online ad market. It defines the flow of our news feeds, the ways in which we're tracked by big tech companies, and so much else. This is a great text for us to dive into, both from the perspectives of DPLA and Unfinished. And before we jump in, I want to also quickly say welcome to all of our viewers. I'd really love for this to the extent that it's possible via Zoom to be an open dialogue of sorts. So of course, Tim and I are going to set the foundation of this discussion and have a bit of a conversation here together for the next 20 or 30 minutes or so, but we'd love to explore audience questions as well. So throughout our conversation, please go ahead and share your thoughts and questions in the chat, and we'll turn to them shortly. And I'd really just encourage everyone to think in terms of, this is our digital existence, right? This is not necessarily a topic that we need to approach from the most technical standpoint. Everyone is interacting with the technology that we are going to be discussing today. So really come at this conversation from the perspective of ideas and curiosity. I'd really encourage that. As a starting point also to the audience, I'd love to invite you just right now, for those of you in the chat, just type out, tell us where you're joining us from right now. Like maybe you're in Chicago, maybe you're in Tucson, maybe you're in, Madagascar would be cool. Tell us where you're at, and then tell us how you're showing up today. Like, are you curious? Are you excited, intrigued, skeptical? Just kind of get it out there. Tell us how you're feeling in the chat. I see someone from Ann Arbor. Nice. Very cool. Denver wishes they were in Madagascar. All right. So thank you again for joining us. So all that now said, Tim, hello.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Just the most basic question. Why did you decide to write this book?
Absolutely. So the origins of this book were a few years that I actually spent working at Google. So for a few years, I was global head of public policy for Google on AI and machine learning. And it was a weird time, and I learned a lot. But I think one of the most intriguing things about sort of the culture of Google on a day-to-day basis is that mostly the company actually doesn't really talk about how it makes money. You talk to engineers, and they're obviously really excited about self-driving cars and, the future of the internet and all this sort of stuff. And, but it would be great, you actually end up these conversations with engineers where you say like, so how do we actually make money? And, they're basically like, well, we make money through ads, of course, right? And then you like drill a little further, you're like, basically like, okay, well, so like, how does it actually work? I think what was most fascinating was learning that even tech people working at these giant companies that are 90% funded through ads can't even give a good account of how they make money. And so the origin of the book really was just kind of for myself trying to figure out how this whole thing works, and to really dig in on like a very, very granular level to say, okay, when you click on a website and an ad is delivered to you, how does that work? In doing that research, I think one of the funny things and sort of interesting things which became really the argument of the book is that I think a lot of the promises that we've sold about how great or how powerful this technology is, this sort of ad-based delivery system that we call programmatic ads, that actually may not be as cracked up as we might have thought in the first place, right? And if you buy that, there's very, very big implications for how the internet will evolve going forwards.
Right. So we'll get into all of that in a minute. I love what you're saying here. Well, I love and am frankly a little bit disturbed by what you're saying about the sort of lack of understanding, even at a company like Google, for example, about where the money is kind of coming from. I was looking into this last week, kind of in preparation for this conversation. Facebook, for example. So Facebook is kind of like second to Google, I think, in terms of like their share of the online.
Duopoly of ads. Yeah, that's right.
Right. And people may be surprised to hear that something like 98% of Facebook's considerable revenue actually comes from marketing. Do you know if Google's number is similar?
It's slightly lower. And what's really interesting is Google's been attempting to sort of diversify over time with, cloud services and what have you. But advertising still accounts for the lion's share of their revenue. So it's very similar to Facebook in that respect.
Right. So these products that we interface with every single day, everyone uses Google search. Well, maybe some people are starting to break away and use something like DuckDuckGo or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, like, most people use Google search because it's the default option, very effective, quick, etc. Similarly, so many of us use Facebook products like Instagram or Messenger, or of course the core Facebook app. I guess we need to call them Meta products now.
Yeah, exactly.
And all of these products that define how we receive information and communicate with one another are kind of fundamentally ad products, which is really kind of crazy to think of it from that perspective. With that in mind, Tim, I wanted to ask you, so a lot of people may not really understand the complexities of online advertising and topics like programmatic ads and ad tracking. One of the reasons I think your book, again for the chat, Subprime Attention Crisis, one of the reasons I think your book is so great is because it really does explain how these technologies work. But for the sake of this conversation, I'd love just to hear from you. What do you think is most important for everyone to know about how these technologies function? How should we be thinking about these technologies in the first place? Because it is very complex, and maybe there's a way that you think to distill it. And I would just love to hear from you, like foundationally, how do you think people really should be thinking about the function of these technologies and the ways in which they impact their lives?
Absolutely. So I think there's kind of 2 points that I'd make here. The first one really has to do with what we mean when we say advertising, right? Sometimes you say advertising and people think of, like Mad Men, right? It's like the 1950s and people are smoking cigarettes and, they're coming up with ad copy. But what's really interesting and important to know about the way most advertising is done, both measured by volume and also definitely by sort of financial value, is this very particular kind of advertising I mentioned a moment ago called programmatic advertising. And that is really a fascinating system that basically, I think leaves Don Draper sort of in the dust and is really the kind of core engine that drives much of advertising today. And what it looks like is nothing like guys hanging out in offices smoking cigarettes, talking about how to sell next year's fashions. What it really is something that looks a lot more like algorithmic trading, right? It looks a lot more like the modern stock market. And what I mean by that is basically that this is a highly data-driven system, which is largely automated, and it's facilitated in these auction-based marketplaces. And it's worth kind of taking a step back because we even kind of forget about it, right, as a piece of infrastructure on the web. When you click on a website, right, that's about to serve you an ad, basically the way this system works is that there's a split-second auction that takes place, right? There's basically a flag that goes out to the world and says, we have a male 25 to 35 living in the Northeast. Does anyone want to deliver an ad to them? And then there is a global auction that happens between all of these algorithms that want to bid for your attention. And of course, the one that wins ultimately gets to deliver the ad. And that all happens basically between the point at which you click on a website and when it actually loads on the website, right? And this is, I think, a really important thing to understand about the web is that we're not necessarily talking about advertising writ large. We're talking about a very specific form of advertising that I think has very particular impacts on the web. And I think this kind of takes me to the second point I want to make in response to your question, Damon, is, I think ads are a really powerful way, not just of kind of thinking about how the web is monetized, but also how like the web is designed as well. I think one of the parlor games that I like playing after writing this book is like, you can take almost every aspect of your everyday experience of the internet and kind of take a step back and say, why is it here? And more often than not, the reason is because ads, right? Because financially, in order to deliver ads, we need to structure these platforms in certain ways. So the one I always give is like, why do we have a like button, right? Like, why does it even exist as a primitive action you could take on social media? Well, one reason is that you really need to measure people's engagement, right? And that's really hard to do without an explicit button that says, I liked this, right? And so, even these kind of fundamental building blocks of how we think about interacting online, I think are very much shaped, if not defined entirely by sort of the prerogatives of ads. And so it's kind of lens on which to see the internet.
Yep. I think, so I want to ask more about that in a second. And I also want to remind our audience, so as you hear about all this, if you have questions about any of this, again, drop them in the chat. We'll get to them because this is the real stuff, right? This is how we are navigating online spaces. And so think in terms of, again, let's take Facebook, for example. So the structure of the Facebook newsfeed, I think it's hardly a secret at this point that there are issues around extremely polarized conversations in the Facebook newsfeed. Obviously, there are very significant issues with the spread of mis and disinformation in the Facebook newsfeed. And the structure of that feed is there to serve advertising, essentially. I mean, and maybe that's the most cynical way of looking at it, because of course, also the newsfeed is where you can look at great pictures of your family and friends and maybe engage with news articles you find meaningful, that kind of thing. But really, the reason we have had that structure for so long at this point, and it really has been, Facebook in the grand scheme of things is a relatively new product, but that newsfeed as a foundational part of that product has been around for quite a while at this point,
Sure.
this algorithmically driven feed. Really, the way the reason that has held on for so long is probably due to its role in this kind of advertising ecosystem, right? And so I'd love to ask you to what extent you think, I mean, whether you buy what I just said, to what extent do you think some of the major problems of our current online paradigm, so again, this mis and disinformation, but even, the leveraging of private data for profit, and maybe even in terms of like the monopolistic tech powers we have that really can crush any competition. Tell us a little bit more about whether you think it's fair to say that a lot of these issues are the direct result of the online ad industry. You were kind of getting at that with what you were saying previously, and I would just love to hear a little bit more about how you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a couple of subtleties here which are interesting and I think worth diving into, right? I think so frequently in these discussions we're just like ads, they're terrible and like they're responsible, they're the root of all evil on the internet, right? And I think that discussion needs to move towards really kind of thinking about what is the relationship between advertising and the design of the internet, A, and then B, the problems that we see on the internet. Because I think there's a really interesting alternative universe where there is no advertising, but platforms still ultimately implement the newsfeed, right? Which is, one of the reasons you implement a newsfeed is obviously you want to drive engagement and you want to deliver ads and all this other stuff. But another reason is also you just want to make content more discoverable on the platform, right? You say, oh man, it's really hard for people to find content that they really like and want to see on Facebook. That's almost like a total, parallel story for why you might implement this that doesn't rely on ads. And so I think we have to be open to the idea that ads might not necessarily have ended up being the driving force of the internet, but we still may have ended up with a bunch of different features that we identify with platforms like Facebook. So that's the first subtlety. I think the second subtlety is, I think getting to the question of, okay, what kinds of problems can we hang on the hat, or hang on advertising? And I think for certain, right, like, I think the intense sort of data hunger, right, of the platforms is deeply tied to advertising, for instance, right? Because there's always a hope that if you collect more data about someone, you could target an ad better to them. And, therefore, you'd be able to sort of price that attention at a higher level of value, right? And so certainly I think, the argument for ads leading to sort of the data hunger of the industry is definitely there. Similarly, I buy your argument that, yeah, I think maybe ads are also responsible for sort of the incredible level of corporate consolidation that we see on the web. So one of the ways of thinking about this is, okay, and this gets to part of the argument of the book, is that ads have been declining in value continuously since they were launched online. That means for every one ad, people are making less and less and less money over time, right? And one way of thinking about that is that leads towards consolidation, right? Because the only people who can afford to win are people who have economies of scale and can deliver huge amounts of ads ultimately, right? Now, I think the one place I'll push back, though, is I'm actually not convinced on the third problem that you pointed out, right? Which is, are ads responsible for polarization on the internet? Are they responsible for disinformation on the internet? And, I think that what I always take back to this is there's a great study by Levi Boxall, this economist, that basically was investigating the question of filter bubbles. And they said, look, if filter bubbles are actually the case, then people who are exposed more to social media should have polarized more in the last few decades, right? But they take a look at it and they're like, actually, it turns out that people who have used these platforms the most have polarized the least. That is to say, older people who actually use social media on net less seem to have polarized a lot more, right? And so one of the arguments here actually is that, like, maybe the problems of polarization, maybe the problems of disinformation are a lot less tied to the particular design of social media than we might think. And so again, this is what I mean by kind of nuance on these problems, right? Is I think ads are certainly related to some problems we have, but certainly can't be connected to all of them ultimately.
Right. That the polarization, I'm glad you kind of checked me on that, because, my feeling is we do, so much is said about that particular issue on social media, but then again, we do also have to keep in mind, like, Fox News is still a thing, traditional ads are still a thing, and not all of these perils flow directly from social media, of course. Okay, so we'll keep that in mind. What I'd like to ask now, and you gestured toward this in kind of at the start of our conversation, but so we've just talked about the extent to which the online ad market can be harmful or contribute to some harms, but you actually in the book make a pretty pointed and persuasive argument that the online ad market as we experience it now is actually kind of smoke and mirrors. And you write at one point, there's this great quote. So you say, the value of the attention packaged by online advertising is declining. Online advertising is increasingly ignored or actively resisted by the public at large. And then you continue, the attention that ads do receive is increasingly garbage. The product of a massive fraudulent economy designed to extract money from advertisers. And you compare this market to the housing bubble of 2008, which is, of course, where your book finds its title. Tell us more about this assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I'll start with two stories, right? Because I think like the argument when you first hear it can come off as like a little bit weird, right? Like I think like what's interesting to me is that like whether or not you are, a huge tech skeptic or a huge tech booster, I think we've all kind of gotten under the assumption that, yeah, on some level, right? Like this incredibly powerful data-driven advertising system has to work, right? Because it'd be so crazy if it didn't. Right? Like in some ways, the whole credibility of this entire edifice that we've just been talking about for the last 15 minutes is like dependent on this idea, this very basic idea that it works, right? And so I think there's two stories, and then I can get into kind of explaining why this is the case that hopefully the audience will find interesting. The first one is a few years ago, Procter & Gamble, one of the biggest advertisers in the world, said, well, we haven't really been liking what we've been getting out of digital advertising. So we're going to run this experiment where we basically chop $200 million out of our digital ad spending, right? And they came back and reported at a conference, a few years later, which is basically to say we couldn't recognize any change to our business as a result of cutting that budget out, which is so odd and curious, right? Because it goes to the question of why are you spending this money in the first place? And so, okay, so that's kind of a story from the commercial space. I'm sure many of the people on the call today remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? Mm-hmm. Just to refresh, right? The idea was that you had a shady political operation that illicitly acquired data from Facebook, did this psychographic targeting and influenced the Brexit vote, right? Like it pushed England out of the European Union as a result. A few years later, right, the ICO, the privacy regulator in the UK, did a study where they said, well, look, we can conclude that Cambridge Analytica did commit a huge privacy violation, but we can't find any evidence that what they were promising in terms of psychographic targeting actually worked, actually was material in changing votes, right? And I think this is so intriguing because it really calls into question whether or not what's being sold is in fact something that is worth the money that people are putting into it, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? Part of it is fraud, which you've talked about. Part of it is just people that are paying attention to ads less, right? And then in some cases, right, like I think the other part is that there's also kind of a complicity ultimately in the advertising industry to keep this wheel turning, regardless of whether or not the system actually works.
I want to linger on this point. Sure. So is part of it also just inertia in the sense of like this whole apparatus has been built out, and how do you kind of backpedal from that? Like, I guess, it seems like this is kind of why the allusion to the housing bubble, I think, is kind of alarming in this context, because he kind of suggests that this whole thing might collapse. And then what happens then? Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to apologize for the audience with the winter sun. It looks like I'm about to be.
It's beautiful. It's just like
yeah.
You're getting a nice tan during this conversation.
Yeah, it's actually all very nice. No, I think that's right. I mean, the comparison to the bubble is in large part to kind of think about all the perverse incentives that play out in this space, right? Which is, that if you are in the online advertising industry, right, I think there's huge incentives. And in many ways, I think a lot of companies are in too deep, right? Which is that, like, I think that like it's very difficult for advertisers to say, actually, this thing we've been spending money on for, millions and millions of dollars on for like the last decade, like maybe it just doesn't work, right? The amount of kind of credibility loss that those advertising agencies would face with their clients is like absolutely enormous. And indeed, I think like the big online advertising platforms, right, your Facebooks and the Google of the world, they've competed for a very long time saying, well, the reason you should move your money out of TV, the reason you should move your money out of billboards, right, and bring them over to us is because our kind of advertising is in fact better, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of concerns that if it turns out that it's basically just as bad as all the advertising we've always had, about what happens about the sort of trust and value they've built up in the product that they're ultimately selling.
Do you think there is a lot of trust? I mean, you were just, that Procter and Gamble example is so like striking. So you have major businesses are like, say, I don't know that there's value in this. And then of course, we're increasingly seeing a lot of skepticism from the public. I mean, again, it's only somewhat tangentially related, but the Facebook files and Frances Haugen and the testimony of the past couple of months, and like, it seems like there's a growing level of awareness and in fact, a growing sophistication from the public and from policymakers about some of these issues. And so I want to ask just again, a little bit more about this notion of trust and whether that even still holds.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's a difference between trust and credibility, I think is maybe the right way to paint it. I think it's right that you're saying that I think a lot more people are sort of skeptical about the claims that these companies are making ultimately. I think the billion-dollar question coming out of the book is, okay, Tim, if you're so smart and there's a bubble, when does this bubble pop, right? And I think one of them is, maybe actually it's really important that people's perceptions shift. And the shifting of that perception could have actually big impacts on the market. But yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think we live in a really interesting world right now where we have a lot of skepticism of the companies in the sense that people are angry about Facebook, they're angry about social media, they're angry about the big tech companies. But I think there's also still ultimately a belief that they wield great power. And that's the reason why we should take action around them, right? Yeah. And I think, one of the reasons I think the book, I've been really happy with the reception of the book is that basically it's pissed off everybody, right? Which is basically because there's another way of reading this argument, which is, well, maybe we actually don't have to really worry about ads all that much because they don't actually influence us. I don't actually believe that. I think there's reasons to worry about the system that we've built. But I think it's sort of subversive in that sense as well. And that's kind of what I mean by sort of trust and credibility, right? Which is we have very low trust in Facebook, but we still think their claims to being able to have this data-driven mind control array, that's a credible claim. We credit it. And in many ways, the reason we believe it is the reason why we have that skepticism in the first place.
So interesting. Okay. We're starting to get some good audience questions. We're going to turn to them in just a minute. I want to ask you just one last thing for my part, which is something that's very forward-looking. So, okay, we've had this brief, but I think very substantive conversation about some of the issues of the current paradigm, the ways in which fundamentally the ways in which the current digital economy works, right? And one of the themes that we're really interested in at Unfinished, as you know, Tim, you joined us for our event in September, which is, it was themed around decentralization and this notion that the future is quote unquote decentralized. So this is the idea that new technologies like blockchain, if developed and deployed in certain ways, could push us toward a world where individuals have more independence and autonomy to participate in the digital economy is kind of the fundamental thinking there. And of course, there's been so much conversation recently about cryptocurrencies, NFTs, DAOs, et cetera. Do you think these technologies have a chance of upending the digital ad market as we know it? And by that, I mean like really allowing us to create a new economy for the digital world. Are these good replacements? What might come next? I would just love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think there's a camp of there's a camp in the blockchain sort of decentralized Web3 universe, which is one that I deeply disagree with. But I am sort of, interested in the technology in part because of not necessarily the technology itself, but the psychology. So that's a very vague way of saying it. Let me dive into that a little bit more, right? So you occasionally meet crypto heads who sort of, read the premise of Subprime Attention Crisis, and they basically say, yeah, and the way we're going to fix this is micropayments on the blockchain, right? And there's this deep faith that ultimately that if we got the technological protocol correct, right, we could just sort of get the internet to work again. And I think that's a fundamental misreading of really the last 20 years of internet history, right? Which is the rhetoric in the early 2000s was, we've got this great protocol, right, called the open web. And once you take on this open web protocol, all else follows, right? It's impossible to maintain a dictatorship once you adopt to the open web, right? It's impossible for publishers to, lock in control of creative content, once they face the open web. And what we failed, I would say, in the early 2000s was this vision that ultimately that the tech protocol was destiny, right? That we could invent something that was so clever technologically, right, that it would overcome all opposition, right, and fix the problems that we have. I actually am excited about sort of some of the DeFi stuff actually on the other side of the coin, which is to basically say that really what you have in advertising is a question about the psychological price of content, right? So it's really hard to get people to subscribe to things because they've been raised on the internet where everything is free, right? And so one question about whether or not you can make alternative models sustainable is, can you just change norms about what people are willing to pay for, what people are willing to put their dollars towards? Because otherwise, we're actually in deep trouble, right? It's really difficult to get content to be floated in any other way other than ads because the psychological price is $0.00, right? And so, you can almost kind of think of all of the blockchain stuff as a kind of Jedi mind trick. The technology doesn't mean anything. It will change nothing. It's actually at a fundamental level is environmentally destructive and has all the other reasons that people have critiqued it for. In the context of ads, one thing you might be able to say for it is if it becomes a big enough phenomenon, maybe people are like, yeah, this is a JPEG on the internet. It's totally dumb to pay for this, but it's like totally a norm. Like I'm glad to pay for it, right? And if it changes that norm, I think it achieves a huge change in the behavior of the web, but it has nothing to do with the technology, right? It has everything to do with, can we pull off this sleight of hand, right? Where we go from JPEGs being things that you can right click to JPEGs where it's kind of dirty for you to right click it and you really should pay for it, right? And suddenly I think like a lot of business models emerge that wouldn't otherwise be possible. And so I guess ultimately I'm a cynic and a pragmatist about the technology, but I think that doesn't necessarily reduce the argument that it still may be important.
Yeah. Okay, man, we could talk for a lot longer about that, but I will just say that I love the notion that it's actually more about norms and culture than the technology per se. And I think that is kind of the connection point that everyone ought to be paying a lot of attention to. Okay, so you ready for some audience questions?
Sure, let's do it. Yeah, that'd be great.
We have some. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, here's a good one here. It's a bit specific, but I think it's a very good, it's a good question. So sure. These are all good questions. Everyone's asking great questions. So recent privacy enhancements like HTTPS everywhere and the blocking of third-party cookies have led Google to say that they are preparing for a cookieless internet. I believe there was, they made an announcement last year about shifting their technology a bit and developing an alternate model. How will that work and what effect will it have on the revenue of websites?
Yeah, absolutely. So, to return to the question that we briefly touched on earlier, right? It's the, okay, Tim, you're so smart. There's a bubble. When does the bubble actually arrive? And I have a couple of scenarios in my mind about how this happens. One of them is actually kind of building off of what the questioner is asking about, right? Which is basically that, what's happening among the big tech players is that there's actually kind of a circular firing squad going on, right? They all see the writing on the wall. They all want to avoid regulation. They all want to show the public that they're more privacy protecting than the other guy. And so as a result, they're implementing all of these changes that have vast effects on the ad market as a whole, right? So the technology that you're mentioning from Google is a technology called Flock. And the end result of Flock basically is that you have personal data that's aggregated into these flocks. And the notion is basically that you can still do good ad targeting without being able to need access to the underlying data of any one person in a flock. There's a bunch of problems with this. I guess my prediction ultimately is that it leaves Google in a position where they get access to all the data, but it's very hard for everybody else to get access to the data. That being said, though, it might still potentially pop the bubble, which I think is intriguing because a bunch of these other people who are left out in the cold will say, oh God, I can't lose access to this data or else my ads won't work anymore. I would propose to the audience that I think there's one interesting outcome where they lose access to the data and nothing happens to their business models, that like ads are still pretty much as good or bad as they used to be, which suddenly throws into question the value of all this data they've been collecting and sort of a cookie-based architecture of the world. And so I think there's this kind of really interesting set of outcomes where the companies in competing with one another actually puncture a lot of the beliefs about how good this system is. And in part, it's because these privacy measures create these natural experiments where people lose access to data. And, we're about to find out, like, how valuable is it?
Right. It brings to mind a little bit too the changes that Apple adopted in iOS that Facebook, of course, is up in arms with.
Yeah, and it's a similar game where actually, I mean, now Apple's making huge amounts of revenue on ads, right?
Right.
Yeah, so I think it's like we live in a world where basically the rich will get richer, but I do think that there's potential outcomes on sort of trust in this ad market as a whole.
Right. Right. So potentially good from the privacy perspective, but not so good if you're concerned about monopoly power, for example.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I mean, if we're, I mean, we're in a funny space on the internet right now. It's like, well, I just want the people I trust to be spying on me,
Exactly. Right. Right. Okay. So next question here. Do you think that it is feasible that some of these free services could start to be perceived as an essential utility, considering, for example, the impact of when WhatsApp was unavailable due to Facebook being down? Of course, there was a huge Facebook outage, was a couple months ago, and all of these services were impacted.
Yeah. I guess I'll reveal a little bit of my sort of political bias here, because I am not one of those crypto heads, like everything will be solved by micropayments on the blockchain. I really believe that, yeah, maybe the alternative to ads is just subscription. Maybe people just pay for content, right? I think one of the perverse effects of the ad-based internet economy is that we've always been able to kind of kick the can down the road as to whether or not we think some of these services are essential utilities. The reason being is because they're offered to the consumer for free, right? So we never even have to confront the question of, is Google, a public utility? Because sort of no one's being kind of harmed in an antitrust sense, right? That they're basically not a monopolist that's increasing the price to the consumer. Now, I think one of the useful things about a world in which we have a lot more subscription is that we suddenly confront access questions, right? Which is some people can pay for subscription, some people can't pay for subscription. I happen to believe that that really forces the question of, okay, well, maybe we should subsidize access as a society to some of these services, right? And so, yeah, I do think that, like, ultimately, the fall of the ad market would really also kind of have this follow-on effect, which is to force us to confront the question of, like, what is important enough now, right, in living in the 21st century, that you want sort of government involvement or government regulation with these platforms as utilities. Now, I think the fun question, maybe food for thought for the audience, and I don't have any particularly right answers here, is like, we can all kind of agree, like, probably having access to a search engine, that's like almost as important as having like electricity to your house, right? But then, okay, we'll go to the next level. Is it that important for you to have access to Facebook or Twitter? Okay, is it important for you to have access to TikTok? How about Parler when it was around? Is that an essential utility? Right? Like, and there's a fascinating set of questions about, okay, what is the level of significance a platform needs to rise to for us to believe that it deserves this regulation? And I think there's like a lot of really interesting kind of intellectual work there to be like, what is actually like a principled way at this problem?
Right. And how did these services attain that status, right? Is it an issue of their scale, in which case that, that's a can of worms as well. So
yeah, exactly. And I do think that, ultimately, I think the companies may very well go the way of an AT&T, right? Where they say, look, we can live with a world where you keep us as the monopoly, but we're willing to play ball with you, right? I think that a lot of the kind of theater that we see in Congress right now, right, hauling these CEOs in front of Congress, is like both sides saber rattling to see, the compromise they can get ultimately. That's how I read it.
Yep, I think that's right. Okay, next question. If the ad bubble bursts, what are the real world ways that people would be impacted, and who would be most affected?
Yeah, this is kind of a funny question, because I think there are some people who are ad anarchists, right? Who are basically just like, yeah, this system is garbage. Let's just let it fall over, right? Like, why not let it fall over? And I think my real worry about this is sort of threefold, right? Because we really kind of forget about all the things that ads subsidize in our everyday lives, right? So, one thing very obviously, right, is that ads are the reason for a lot of the news and journalism we have, right? It's still the fundamental funding mechanism that makes a lot of that possible, right? And so, man, if we're worried about the precarious state of the media today, we may be even more worried when the ad system goes down, right? And there's obviously huge like human impact in all the people who are involved in that. Secondly, we have all these services that we get for free, right? So Google Docs, Google Search. I think another way you can imagine impact is basically like what happens if suddenly you have to be charged for those services, right? Like WhatsApp right now is still something that is just like a big appendage, like from an accounting standpoint, it's just this leech on the balance sheet of Facebook. If it goes down, right, or it's no longer worth it for Facebook to do, right, suddenly a lot of people lose access. And then the final one, which is very near and dear to my heart, which is like a little bit more niche, but I think is kind of fun to think about, is doing AI at Google. There's this lab called DeepMind. And DeepMind is the one that created the AI that beat the Go champion, right? It's like doing all these breakthrough technologies. It's a huge waste of money from an accounting standpoint, right? It's advancing basic research, which is incredibly, incredibly valuable, but it just loses money. It's just in the red all the time. And unfortunately, we've ended up in a world where a lot of basic R&D has been outsourced to private institutions, and those private institutions are funded through ads, right? And so there's also a worry about scientific progress, right, if this ad ecosystem goes down, which I think additionally is like a really fascinating aspect of this.
So interesting. Wow. Yeah, I would not have thought from that perspective, but of course it makes perfect sense. This is where the money comes from, after all.
And I make the argument in the book, and I think there's good counter arguments, but also you can kind of think about all the wealth that's also been created by ad dollars, right? Like Zuck has the Zuck Chan initiative, which is their philanthropy that's funding all of these nonprofits, right? Mm-hmm. And like that additionally, right, is impacted by the value of the stock, which is driven by these ecosystems. So I think a little bit like the subprime crisis, right? Like we have a financial asset which is now leaked into all these parts of the economy and will have ripple effects if it ends up in trouble.
Yep. Okay. Here's one from Ava, who was the one person who actually used the official Q&A function within Zoom, which we do love to see. I was the one who said to use the chat, so we got the questions, don't worry about it. Tim, what monetization alternatives do you see? Mm-hmm. Subscriptions, donations, like the Wikipedia model, etc.
Yeah. So as I said, I'm a little bit old-fashioned in this sense, right? That I do think that like maybe subscription is ultimately how we make this work, right? And like, I don't know if it needs to be much fancier than that in some ways. And again, to kind of like, jump back in time and jump to the present again, right? Part of the vision, part of the dream of the early 2000s was 1,000 true fans, right? Which is people were like, there's this amazing thing, it's called the long tail. It's so cool. You're going to set up a blog and all you need to get is 1,000 true fans to give you some money. And you can make a living as a creator on the internet, right? Didn't turn out to be the case. It turns out it's like really, really hard to get 1,000 true fans and it was very difficult to actually make a living. But I still think this is like a really great dream of the internet, right? It's just like just doing your own weird niche thing, you could make a living. And, I think part of the hope now, right, is that basically like subscription and payments on the internet have become a lot more frictionless in ways that make it a lot more doable than it was before, right? And this is very practical, right? Like in the 2000s, if you're trying to set up a payment gateway to do subscription newsletters, right, it would just be a lot more of a pain in the ass than it is today. And so there's maybe a hope that basically some of these dreams can become realized and become scalable in a way that they weren't even 10 years ago.
Right. Great. Okay, here's a question from Adrian about Web3. So I see Web3 as the place where all the Wall Street wolf went after eating the digital advertising market, as commented in Subprime Attention Crisis. So they talk about fixing the web and whatnot, but my question is if Tim sees some similarities in that regard, the link between Web3 and Wall Street.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. Not least of which is that there's a lot of Wall Street people in Web3 now. And so, yeah, they share personnel. And I think that it might, interest the person who asked the question that this actually also happened in the ad industry as well, right? When I say like the programmatic ad system is built like the stock market, it's because it was built in the image of the stock market. One of the fascinating things in the early history of companies like Google and a lot of the companies that kind of pioneered digital ads are basically finance people, saying, oh yeah, it actually turns out that you can set up a market, which is very just much like the stock market, but for ads, right? And actually like, in the programmatic ad space, there's businesses that are called trading desks right? Like there's a lot of kind of language that's sort of borrowed from that space. And I think there's two tendencies here, right? Like one of them is a tendency to, try to optimize growth in the same way that sort of finance has optimized growth. It's certainly been the case kind of in the sort of ad space. And I could imagine that's actually maybe the case in sort of Web3 as well, right? That there's kind of this desire to say like, how do we just like maximize how big this market can get over time? And, again, we think about the bubble dynamics here, right? Which is like, do a lot of people maximizing short-term gains ultimately jeopardize the value of the ecosystem as a whole? I think that's very possible. And, there's that question, I think, in Web3 for sure.
Can you give a specific example of some of that? Do you mean in terms of things like Shiba coin, for example? And
yeah, that's right. I mean, I was having dinner with a friend last night and he was like, well, look, like a Ponzi scheme is bad, but only if it collapses, right? And I was like, I don't know about that argument, man. But yeah, I mean, I think, there are, and this is the kind of question with currency, right? Which is, okay, you're going to start a coin. You want people to buy into that coin, right? But in the initial phase, it is a kind of Ponzi scheme, right? Which is you gather more people to pay in so you can pay off the people who are already in the system. Now, when does a currency move from being a Ponzi scheme to a currency? Well, it's when there's so much adoption that everybody sort of bought in and uses it as a, token of value, essentially. And so again, this kind of leads Web3 to have the flavor that it has, which is that there's like true believers and cynics, and sometimes it's very difficult to tell the difference.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Next question here is from Sloan. Aside from the Procter & Gamble example you noted, is there evidence that more big advertisers are catching on to the subprime-like dynamics of this industry, voting with their dollars and moving toward alternatives? Google and Meta are still growing revenues at 40+% year over year as maybe a counterpoint. Yeah.
No, and I think that's a great counterpoint to bring up. Maybe two kind of points on this. So the first one is, one big counter argument that I did when the book came out is I talked to lots of ads people who are basically like, look, Tim, you wouldn't actually really believe that the biggest companies, most sophisticated companies in the world would put this money into the ad market if it was a total fraud, would you? And like two things, one of them that's like exactly the rhetoric we heard before the 2008 blow up, right? And then also the second one is actually we have these really fascinating cases where super sophisticated companies have been losing their shirts in the ad economy, right? So two cases, one of them is last year, it turned out that Uber disclosed that they had discovered they were losing about $100 million to ad fraud and like didn't realize it, right? And then the other one, which is a lot more, recent, is Aussie Media, right? Which in addition to attempting to pull off a scam where they pretended to be someone from Google, the bigger thing is the reporting from, Craig Silverman and others, which basically said, look, they were defrauding their ad buyers using the techniques of ad fraud. And who was defrauded? JP Morgan, right? Like really, really big, sophisticated companies who you'd assume would be good at this, right? And so maybe a response to Sloan's question is, unfortunately, it kind of seems like the big advertisers are still not catching on, or in the very least, they have some willful ignorance around what's going on, right? The other thing which might be sort of interesting to think about is imagine for a moment all of the money in the world which is spent on advertising, not just digital ad spending. One of the interesting things to consider is that all of the older forms or channels of advertising, newspapers, magazines, even TV to some extent, right, have, at least in recent years, lost traffic. They've become smaller over time. And one view of why Google and Meta still grow 40% year over year, right, is that that money in advertising literally has nowhere to run. And it's not like advertisers are going to pull back the amount of ad spend that they have. And so, this is kind of an interesting argument, at least I think, for why money might still be flowing to the online economy, even in spite of people knowing that these problems are building up, in part because there's nowhere else to spend the money, right? Which I think is kind of like an interesting dynamic that kind of plays out and has actually parallels to the subprime mortgage crisis.
So interesting. Okay. And here's a question from Laura. So what do you recommend average users or average people do to address all the issues that you have addressed in your book? Like, how do we participate in these issues?
Yeah. So there's small acts of resistance. And then I think if you really want to be kind of like an activist around this stuff, what I think like is important to do. So the small acts of resistance are, make the internet more noisy, right? Like click on ads you don't care about, right? Search for things you don't care about, right? Like the more messy the data becomes, the more polluted the data becomes, right? Like I think these are like small grains of sand in the gears, right? And I think that there's like, something that there's like small acts of resistance in like itself just kind of polluting the noise of the data that advertisers have about you. One of the things I really want to do is I've been trying to work on a script that allows it to make it easy to basically for you to set up an ad fraud operation in your home. So with just like a few clicks of a button, you can start making money off of the ad system by selling fraudulent attention. And so like, I do think that there's like kind of like individual forms of resistance that I think are helpful here. I think that the bigger recommendation outside of these kind of fun trolley things though, is maybe to kind of like restructure how we think about what we like and don't like about the internet. And what I mean by that is that there's so much about our activism around big tech companies and holding big tech to account, which is very much tied up in actually buying a lot of the claims that they make about themselves, right? We buy the claim that AI is incredibly effective and all powerful, right? And like, that's why we need to regulate it, right? We buy the idea that Facebook's ad systems can, swing elections, right? And is like incredibly powerful and well targeted. But I think in many cases, like the data sort of doesn't back that up. But that doesn't necessarily mean we should just be like, okay, then Google and Facebook are okay. Like, I think we need to build a form of tech critique, tech resistance. And of course, there's lots of people doing this, but I think, something that's worth reiterating, right, is how do we build a critique that doesn't actually rely on these industries' claims, essentially, right? And like maybe the reason that we want to, do something about these companies has nothing to do with sort of like their marketing, ultimately.
Right. We're gonna have to follow up with you about this ad fraud operation script because
I warn you, it may be very illegal, but I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah, so we'll figure that out. Let's communicate. Get me on Signal, maybe.
All right. Yeah. My people will talk to your people.
Yeah. We're gonna turn it back over to John in just a second, but one last question I always like to ask in a conversation like this is just for further reading. So first of all, obviously everyone should of course read Subprime Attention Crisis, but what would you recommend to people who are like really interested in some of these issues or really want to understand with more nuance some of the issues present in our interactions with technology? What would you turn them towards? What should they read? What sites, what organizations should they connect with? Do you have any recommendations?
So there's 3 people that I'll highlight here. All of them are great. And I think they have like very different views on the issue, but I think if you're interested in this stuff, it's worth like looking into their stuff. So the first guy's a guy by the name of Matthew Crane, C-R-A-I-N, who is in some ways kind of like a historian of programmatic advertising. Just came out with a book recently, but his papers are available online and I think are worth reading as well. And he does a lot about kind of like the origin story of all this, right? Like, how did it come to be? What are the commercial incentives that cause VCs to be like, yes, this is the business model? And so if you're interested in kind of like the prehistory, right, how we got here, Matt's awesome and you should definitely look into his stuff. If you're interested in sort of the shenanigans of the ad industry as a whole, there's a reporter by the name of Shoshana Wodinsky, who is an amazing reporter who is basically doing a lot of stuff, which I think is like great, accessible, investigative journalist work into like what's going on here and why it's important. And so I like highly recommend that as well.
At Gizmodo.
Yeah, Gizmodo, sorry, right. And then the final one that I'll mention is a buddy of mine by the name of Augustine Fu, who I always joke, it's like, I don't know if ad fraudsters like stole Augustine's dog or something, like kidnapped his dog, but he's just like made it his life's work to like root out ad fraud. And he's a maniac about it and I love him for it. And he's, very active on Twitter and he thinks we're worth checking out as well.
Excellent. Thank you for those recommendations, Tim. And thank you again for this conversation. Turning it back over now to John Bracken at DPLA to close this out. John, I believe you're muted.
Yeah, I am. Look at that. There's a rule that every one of these sessions has to have that line dropped. So we hadn't done that yet. So that's why I stayed on mute. Just to put a bookmark down for a future discussion, especially at the end there, Tim, I'm really interested to hear more, sitting here as a parent and thinking about the testimony happening on it from Instagram today on the Hill, for instance, and knowing that as a parent and as we think about online life and culture and the experience of our children coming on, and how everything you just talked about impacts and may be changing, and how we, as I'm the parent of a 12-year-old who soon will have a mobile device like this and doesn't quite yet. It strikes me that as a library, as a DPLA, and as Unfinished, and potentially as it touches some of our personal lives, that's a topic that we might want to put a bookmark in for a future discussion, selfishly. So thanks everyone for being here. Tim, thank you. Unfinished team, and Damon, thanks so much. I think my task is to invite you guys to a party. I think it's not going to suck. We're going to try really hard to make this virtual holiday reception that we're doing next Thursday at 4 p.m. I know everyone's tired of Zoom happy hours, but I promise we're going to make this fun, because this has been such a crazy long year. So Kat magically is putting up an invite to be part of if you're part of the DPLA community or want to see it in person in a virtual happy hour environment, come hang out with us next Thursday. And then just 2 breadcrumbs to put down for January. Our open board meeting discussion will take place on January 10th in the afternoon, and there'll be a link for that. And we're going to do a discussion. One of the areas of work we work in is around ebooks, and focusing on making ebooks and digital content more accessible to libraries and library users. And we're going to have a discussion about that work, collaborating for access, licensing models to benefit readers, libraries, and publishers. And we're doing that with another set of friends of ours, the group called Readers First, and COSLA, which are this amazing collection of the state librarians across the country. And that meeting will be engaging librarians and publishers in the discussion about how we expand digital access. That's going to be January 19th. That's the end of my plug list. Damon, do you want to do a plug for anything Unfinished has coming up at the end of the year and into next year? Or Tim, you for that matter?
I would just say, for our part, please check us out at unfinished.com and follow us on Twitter, sign up for our newsletter. So as I mentioned in the lead up to this conversation, we were spotlighting passages from Tim's book and cultivating some conversation there. So I really encourage you, if you're interested in topics such as this, we really want to engage you and converse with our audience. So please check out our newsletter, go to unfinished.com. And like I said, we're a new organization building up more editorial content and finding more ways to partner with great organizations like DPLA for conversations such as this one. So follow along and join us. Tim, you got a plug?
No. Yeah.
All right, we are out.
This
Thanks,
book
everyone.
is the plug.
Cool. Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.